Welcome to the pre-last lecture in the Leo Baeck Institute's 70th anniversary lecture series. My name is Magda Vrobel, and I'm Associate Director of Public History in the LBI New York. For those from you who were unable to join us for the previous lectures, I'm pleased to remind you that the Leo Baeck Institute is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. As part of the celebration, LBI has launched a special series of 7 lectures, each exploring one key theme in German Jewish history through the lens of evolving historiography. Historiography, like history itself, changes with each generation of scholars. Through this lecture series, the LBI seeks to present a wide-ranging view of 7 major topics in German Jewish history, asking how the way we write and understand the history has transformed over times. And so far, we had lectures about politics, religion, early modern, migration, and economy. Today's topic is Austria. And as you perhaps still remember, yesterday we commemorated Veterans Day. November 11th is also in the date when the fighting during the World War I ceased. And November is also considered as the symbolic date when the Habsburg monarchy officially ended. And now I would like to present and introduce you our special guest and the speaker today, who is one of the major contributors in the field of Jewish history in Habsburg monarchy. Professor Marsha Rozenblit will discuss Austria in German Jewish historiography over the past decades. So Marsha Rozenblit is the Harvey Meyerhoff Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Maryland, where she has been on the faculty since 1978. A social historian of the Jews of the Habsburg monarchy and its successor states, she's the author of 2 scholarly books, The Jews of Vienna, 1867-1914, Assimilation and Identity, published by the State University of New York Press in 1983, and Reconstructing a National Identity, The Jews of Habsburg Austria During World War I, published by Oxford University Press, 2001. She has also co-edited 2 books, Constructing Nationalities in East Central Europe, published by Bergen Press, 2005, and World War I and the Jews, Conflict and Transformation in Europe, the Middle East, and America, also published by Bergen Press, 2017. And Professor Rozenblit she has also written over 35 scholarly articles on such topics as Jewish religious reform in 19th century Vienna, Jewish courtship and marriage in 1920s Vienna, and German Jewish schools in Habsburg Moravia. She served as the president of the Association of Jewish Studies 2009-2011. And just a few words regarding the housekeeping. After the lecture, there will be time for Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please write it in the Q&A box. And I would also like to mention that only questions related to the topic of the lecture will have a chance to be answered in the Q&A part. And now, Marsha, please, the microphone and the Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much, Magda, and thank you to all the people who are in this webinar. I can't see you, but you can see me, and that's good. By the way, I'm not from Habsburg, Austria. I'm from Brooklyn, and my family is East European in background. So I come to this because it's an interesting thing to study. Now, the image of the Leo Baeck Institute is that it's a place, an archive, a library, an institution for the study of the history and culture of the Jews of Germany. It was founded, after all, in 1955 by German Jews. Most of the archival and library material is on Jews in Germany. Most of the articles in its publication, the Leo Baeck Institute Yearbook, are on German Jews. And most of the funding comes from Germany. So most people think of it as German. But the Leo Baeck Institute is also a central research institution for our understanding of the Jews of Austria. And not just of the Austrian Republic that existed between 1918 and 1938, and then again after World War II to the present, the First and the Second Republic, but also the Habsburg monarchy, the Austria-Hungary, which it was technically only from 1867 to 1918, but the Austrian Empire that preceded it for for a very long time before that. And I'm going to show you some maps just to get you to be familiar with the geography. I won't show them the whole time, but I will show them for part of the time so you can get a sense of them. Okay, so that's just a map of Europe in 1900. And as you can see, there's the huge Russian Empire there. This is Austria-Hungary, the red. It's very big. It's bigger than Germany. This is Germany, the green, Italy, etc. Okay, so this is Austria-Hungary between Russia and Germany, and also other countries. And that's what it looks like just by itself. Austria-Hungary, it had many provinces. This was the large Kingdom of Hungary. This is which the Austrian monarchs acquired in the 16th and 17th centuries. This is the province of Galicia, which was a part of Poland traditionally, but Austria acquired it when Poland fell apart at the end of the 18th century. Bohemia and Moravia and Silesia, today the Czech Republic, but then part of Austria-Hungary. Austria, the Habsburgs acquired that in the 16th century. And this is the Habsburg hereditary lands. That's the territory that since the Middle Ages they controlled. It's more or less, it's not exactly, but more or less contemporary Austria. Croatia, Slavonia belonged to Hungary, actually. It became part of interwar Yugoslavia, and now it's two separate countries. Never mind. We don't have to go into all the details of this. But here's Bosnia, which was part of Austria-Hungary as well. It's now a separate country. Okay, the next map is the successor states, just to give you a sense of Europe after World War I. And you can see Austria is much smaller, right? But other countries, what we call the successor states, have come into existence. Czechoslovakia, a much smaller Hungary. Poland was recreated in 1918. And Romania, which existed before 1918, was enlarged. This is Yugoslavia, then called, it wasn't called Yugoslavia till 1926, and it was called the Kingdom of the Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes. But anyway, and again, we're not going to go into details about it, but you can see a much smaller Austria. That's a picture of interwar Austria, just this territory, which is more or less Austria today. Here is Vienna. This is the Danube River. Okay, that's just Vienna. Okay, so I'm gonna actually stop sharing for a while so you can see me, I think. Is that how it works? How does this work? I don't remember, but it doesn't matter. Okay, stop share. There we go. Okay, so so we're dealing with both the Habsburg monarchy, or Austria-Hungary, it was as it was known after 1867, and the successor states to Austria-Hungary. Now, why? Why does the Leo Baeck Institute care about the Jews of Austria? Isn't it about Germany? Well, many Jews in the Austrian Empire, not all of them, but many Jews in the Austrian Empire or in Austria-Hungary and its successor states spoke German and were part of the world of German culture and made German the language of Jewish modernization and made it even a Jewish language, a language in which Jews talked to each other. Not to mention the fact that many Jews crafted great works of German literature and culture. Kafka, for example, who lived in Prague, right? He knew Czech too. He was totally fluent in Czech too, but he wrote his great masterpieces in German. So one could go on and on. And so the Leo Baeck Institute has many archival and library holdings about Austrian Jews. And today I'm going to, of course, focus on the historiography of the Jews of Austria, of the big Austria, and how that has changed over time. Now, the old historiography, the old writing about the Jews of Austria, and by Austria, I don't mean the little country of Austria that has existed since 1918, but rather the Austrian Empire or Austria-Hungary. The old historiography, and there wasn't a huge amount of old historiography, but most of what existed focused on issues including emancipation of the Jews, anti-Semitism, how Jews coped with anti-Semitism, and with famous Jews. And in the successor states, it also focused on these issues. But of course, it focused also on the issue of the relationship of Jews to the local nationalisms. And that was true even in the, for Austria as a whole. But when the old historiography focused on the issues of Jews to the new nationalisms that emerged in the 19th century, Czech nationalism, Polish nationalism, and so forth, it focused on leading spokesmen, on political leaders, on political groups, and not on ordinary people and how they understood their national identities. The old historiography, both for the pre-World War I period and the interwar period, also focused on intellectuals. So there was a large literature on people like Kafka, Franz Kafka, or Sigmund Freud, or writers like Arthur Schnitzler and Stefan Zweig, who were German writers in Vienna, Jewish writers in Vienna. Their work was good and interesting and important, but it had problems. The focus on leaders and intellectuals left out important groups. It left out ordinary people. It left out women. It left out those who didn't fit the prevailing paradigm of what Jews did or looked like. And the prevailing image of the Jews in Austria-Hungary and in the Austrian Republic, both, was that they were mostly prosperous, except in Galicia, where they were mostly poor. They were obsessed with anti-Semitism and how to respond to it, because anti-Semitism was a serious problem. And they were at the same time blind to its significance. And this is the old historiography, and in the nationality struggles, and let me explain them in a second, but the nationality struggles, they sided, that is, the Jews sided with the dominant group to their detriment. So in Bohemia and Moravia, what is today the Czech Republic, they sided with the Germans, and the Czechs hated them for it. That's the prevailing notion. Let me just stop for 1 second and explain that Austria-Hungary was not a nation state. It didn't have a dominant group. It didn't have a dominant language. It was a mishmash of many different groups, many different languages, many different religions, okay? The Austria-Hungary after 1867, or the Austrian half of Austria-Hungary, recognized that there were 11 languages in the country. There was German, there was Hungarian, there was Romanian, there was Italian, there was Polish and Ukrainian and Czech and so forth. I didn't get up to 11, but you get the idea. And many of the people who spoke these languages in the course of the 19th century developed a consciousness of their being a separate nationality. So there was the development of Czech nationalism and of Polish nationalism, of course, and of other nationalisms. And many of these groups, the Czechs in particular, for example, wanted, well, also the Poles, many of these groups wanted more control over their own affairs within the Habsburg monarchy, and some of them even wanted actual political independence. It was a very complicated thing, and the Jews had to choose which group they would side with, and often they sided with the dominant group, and that it was to their detriment because the other groups hated them for it. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background. The new historiography, which isn't so new, I mean, I'm part of the new historiography, and my book on the Jews of Vienna came out 40 years ago, so it's hardly new. But the new historiography has emphasized what we might call social history. That is, it focuses on ordinary Jews, not just Jewish leaders or Jewish intellectuals. It focuses on ordinary Jews. And for example, this historiography has shown that the Jews were not all so prosperous. Forget Galicia, where we always thought they were all poor, but actually some were rich and some were middle class, and many were poor. But even in places like Vienna, most Jews were not well-to-do. There were well-to-do Jews, of course, but most Jews were not all prosperous. My work on the Jews of Vienna, for example, showed that 2/3 of the Jews who lived in Vienna before World War I were too poor to pay the annual taxes to the Jewish community. And that was only 5 kronen a year, which was the equivalent at the time to $5 American at the time. So, $100 today, but they were too poor to pay that. They still got services from the Jewish community, but they were too poor to pay the dues. So that's one issue that has been understood more fully. But a focus on ordinary people has led us to understand the dynamics of Jewish life, migration, such things as migration patterns, occupational change, residential concentrations, organizational networks. I mean, you can learn a lot if you look at ordinary people. And I'll just use the example of my own work since I know it the best. My work on the Jews of Vienna, which appeared the copyright date is 1983. It actually appeared in 84. I was not interested when I did that book. It was my doctoral dissertation, and then I revised it into a book. I was not interested in famous Jews. I rather used as my sources the birth records, the marriage records, the conversion records, the tax records of the Jewish community, the high school gymnasium registration records, all sorts of records like that, to see ordinary Jews who only appear in the historical record when they are born or get married or pay taxes. And as a result of looking at those sources and using a computer to analyze all of that, I created my own databases, after all, I could see how the Jews moved to Vienna from elsewhere in Austria-Hungary after residential restrictions were lifted in 1848. Jews were not allowed to live in the city of Vienna before 1848, although even when they couldn't live there, they did live there because very wealthy Jews could purchase the right to live there for a huge amount of money, but they were allowed to live there with their families and their servants and their employees and their assorted hangers-on. So when no Jews were allowed in Vienna, there were several thousand Jews in Vienna. But after 1848, all the restrictions of that sort ended, and Jews migrated to Vienna. And they did so in 3 waves, I discovered. They first came from Bohemia and Moravia, today's Czech Republic. Then they came from Hungary. I'm going to share so you can look at this on the map. Okay. No, I don't want to look at that map. I want to look at that map. So the first Jews who came to Vienna, here's Vienna on the Danube River in this area, in the province then of Lower Austria. Now it's its own province. But they came from Bohemia and Moravia, what is today the Czech Republic. And they came right away from there. The first wave were Jews from Bohemia and Moravia. They came in the 1850s and 1860s. And then they came from Hungary. But when they came from Hungary, and the next wave was from Hungary, that was in the 18, they started in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, but they came mostly from this Western territory here. That is what is today the western part of Slovakia and the western part of Hungary. And if you notice, it's very close to Vienna. It's really close. It's closer than this map. This map isn't exactly accurate. It's really close. We're talking 20 kilometers. We're talking incredibly close to Vienna. So, but that's where they came from. And a lot of Jews in Hungary lived there, but a lot of Jews in Hungary lived in Eastern Hungary. And this area here, which was a bastion of Hasidism, and this area here, which was another bastion of Hasidism, they didn't move from those areas. They didn't come from Budapest either. They came from Western Hungary. And that was the second wave. And the third wave of migration to Vienna was from this province of Galicia, which was a part of southern Poland. But that was late. That only began at the end of the 1890s and beginning of the 20th century. I mean, of course, anti-Semites jumped up and down saying all the Jews in Vienna came from Galicia, but that was absolutely not true. By 1900, by World War I, the Jewish community of Vienna, which had reached, it was one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe. It was about 175,000 Jews. It wasn't the largest, but it was certainly one of the largest. it was an immigrant community. 25% or so came from Bohemia and Moravia, 25% or so came from Hungary, 25% or so came from Galicia, and 25% were native born, but their parents had come from Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary, and Galicia. Okay, so that's an important thing that I learned by looking at ordinary people. It was not something that anyone knew before. I also looked at the economic transformation of the Jews. Many Jews, when they first came to Vienna, had been involved in commerce at all sorts of levels, from the lowest level of peddlers to, prosperous rich merchants and everything in between. But in Vienna, they modernized and they joined the, city economy, but what they did when the new occupation that they became adherents of was as business employees, as clerks and salesmen and managers in business firms. I mean, many Jews were still merchants and some Jews were professionals, but Jews weren't anything else, in Vienna. And so there is this transformation of them from merchants into business employees. In that process, they were very different from other people in Vienna who either worked in the factories of Vienna. Vienna was a light industry city. It was not a heavy industry city, but there were factories. There were garment center factories. There were furniture factories, shoe factories, brick works, things like that. Jews were not workers there at all. They were not. May have been in New York workers, but they weren't in Vienna. So most Viennese were either factory workers or government workers. Vienna was a government town, after all. It was the seat of the imperial government, of the government of the city, of the government of the province, and so forth. And so most of the workforce in Vienna worked either for the government or in factories, and Jews didn't do either. They had their own economic niche. But also the fact that Jews moved into business employment is a sign that they had acculturated. Because after all, to be a business employee, to be a clerk or a salesman or a manager, one had to speak proper German. One had to dress like other middle-class people, and one had to work on Saturday because Saturday was a regular workday. An independent merchant, certainly a peddler, could decide not to work on Saturday, but a business employee could not. Okay, so there was economic transformation. And also Jews concentrated in some neighborhoods. They chose residential concentration. They chose to live with other Jews and not with people from the same region of the monarchy as they. Vienna was an immigrant city in general, and there were a lot of non-Jews who came from Bohemia and Moravia. The largest immigrant group in Vienna were Czech-speaking workers, mostly workers. And Jews didn't live in the same neighborhoods as them. They lived in neighborhoods with other Jews. And Jews concentrated. This is the last time I'm going to share my maps. Okay, I have some maps of Vienna. Here is a lovely map of the city of Vienna. That this area here is, this blue stream is the Danube. This is the Danube Canal, which was created in the 1860s as a way of stopping the flooding of certain parts of the city. These are the inner district. This is the inner city, the outer, the other districts and more districts. So this is a map of Vienna. But look, those are maps. It's not as clear as it might be because it's been reproduced too many times. But as you can see, the Jews concentrated. They concentrated in the inner city, in the second district. That's the second district, and they concentrated in the 9th district. I can't see where it is. It doesn't matter. But they concentrated in 3 districts, with the largest percentage of Jews living in the 2nd district, which was called the Leopoldstadt. But in Viennese slang, it was called die Matzesinsel, the island of Matzah. And that's because so many Jews lived there. Jews were not forced to live there. There was no anti-Semitic discrimination in housing. Jews chose to live in this area. One map is, the percentage of all Jews who lived in the district. The other map is the percentage of all people in the district who were Jewish. It's just the same way of looking at different ways of looking at the same phenomena. and Jews really did engage in residential concentration. And so they've remained a very distinct group in Vienna. Okay. So in addition, of course, Jews formed a rich network of associations. But my larger point in this book was that Jews certainly acculturated, but they still, at the same time, they declared their difference from others. Jews were a noticeable group in Vienna. They were a Jewish group. They were Jews still. Now, so that's social history. I'm stopping to talk about my own book. So social history has made a big impact, and not just in my book, but in other people's books. Women's history has also made a big mark on our understanding of the Jews of Austria, because women's historians have looked at the experience of women. The model for all this is, of course, Marion Kaplan's wonderful study of Jewish women in Imperial Germany. And the work on Jewish women in Austria is not as advanced as the work on Jewish women in Germany is, I must confess, but there is still some very good work that's been done. Perhaps in some ways, the most important changes have come in the area of national history, that is, the history of the nationality groups of Austria-Hungary. A lot of this work has made us realize how incredibly complicated the nationality struggle was for the Jews. It was complicated in general, and it was especially complicated for the Jews. In all of this, we have to remember that the Jews were often multilingual, right? The Jews in Bohemia and Moravia may have said that German was their primary language, but they also knew Czech and they knew it fluently. And the same could be said for Jews in many other regions. But the nationalists found Jewish multilingualism a problem because you weren't supposed to be multilingual. You were supposed to be members of a national group, and a national group is monolingual. Another problem for the Jews was that many of the national movements were quite anti-Semitic. Not all of them, but many of them were. But as much of this new historiography has shown, often that was mitigated by other factors. So anti-Semitism was situational and tactical. Now, one important study about Jews in the national movement is Hillel Kieval's study on the Jews of Bohemia in the late 19th century. And he showed that many Jews in Bohemia, and increasingly so, sided with the Czechs and not the Germans. The old historiography had emphasized that the Jews were, German in their orientation. But he said in his book, The Transformation of the Jews of Bohemia, that many Jews, in fact, had adopted a Czech national identity and spoke Czech. They were really, because of their multilingualness, they were linguistically ambidextrous, and they decided that they would be better off siding with the Czechs in the complicated struggle between German speakers and Czech speakers in Bohemia. After all, Bohemia was, at that time, not anymore, but at that time, Bohemia was 1/3 German speakers and 2/3 Czech speakers. I say not anymore because Czechoslovakia expelled all the Germans, expelled 3 million Germans in 1945 and 1946. You could do anything to Germans after World War II, and so they expelled them, gave them badges, put them on trains, and sent them to West Germany. But anyway, so Hillel Kieval has shown that the Jews were not all German. Many of them had a Czech identity. And works on interwar Czechoslovakia has shown that too. Titania Lichtenstein's book, for example, on Zionism in Czechoslovakia, that is the interwar period, shows the Czech or the Zionist stance of the Jews. She argues that the German loyalties just declined and either the Czech or the Zionist loyalties of the Jews increased. But other works have shown the persistence of German identity. It's complicated and interesting. For example, Gary Cohen's book on Germans in Prague, and later works for Czechoslovakia by Ines Kölch, who's a German historian, and Michal Frankl, who's a Czech historian, all of them have pointed out how German many of the Jews were. You can see that in school attendance, in language in the synagogue, and so forth. In fact, Gary Cohen argues that only poorer Jews adopted a Czech national identity, and more prosperous Jews did not. Keval wrote after Cohen, and he argues that Cohen is wrong. I mean, it's really a glass half empty, glass half full kind of thing. But but Cohen very clearly says that Jews persisted in their German identities, and Keval does not. Cohen and others also showed that the Germans were not always anti-Semitic. The older historiography had emphasized German anti-Semitism because they had focused either on Vienna or the anti-Semitic movements like the Pan-German movement, which was very anti-Semitic and mostly appealed to people in northern Bohemia and so forth. But so one had the sense, when I was in graduate school, the notion was all Germans were anti-Semitic, right? But Cohen shows that in Prague, in that same book, it's called, I forget what it's called, but it doesn't matter. It's a book about Germans in Prague. Cohen showed that in Prague, Germans did not adopt anti-Semitism, and they accepted Jews into German organizations, including fancy-dancy organizations, social clubs, and that sort of thing. Moreover, the Germans did not engage in anti-Semitic rhetoric during elections. In fact, they wooed Jewish voters to the German Liberal Party, and Jews voted for the German Liberal Party in Prague. And why did they do that, Cohen wondered? Well, because the German speakers in Prague were a minority. In fact, they were only 7% of the population of the city of Prague on the eve of World War I. But Jews were half of all German speakers. Half of all the people who on the census said that they spoke German were Jews. So it wasn't a good idea for the Germans to be anti-Semitic in Prague, right? Because the Jews were a very important source of their political support and their financial support and their other support. So in Prague, the Germans were not anti-Semitic. I've also written a couple of articles on the Jews in Moravia in both the Habsburg period and in interwar Czechoslovakia. My work there shows the same thing, that the German Liberal Party needed Jewish voters and so did not engage in anti-Semitism, even though there Jews were a small part of the population in general. Jews were about 1% of the population of the province, but they were a large part of those who supported the German Liberal Party, and so the German Liberal Party did not become an anti-Semitic political party. So, and frankly, the general historiography about nationalism in the Habsburg monarchy shows the same things. Works by people like the Austrian Lothar Herbelt or the Americans Peter Judson and Tara Zara show that anti-Semitism was only important among Germans in regions that had very few Jews, not in regions that had lots of Jews. Now, of course, the situation in Galicia was even more complicated, and perhaps I'll answer questions about that because it's not my field of expertise. But it does show, all the recent scholarship on the Jews in Galicia shows that the Jews were really caught between the Poles and the Ukrainians in the province. And so many said, we're not Poles, we're not Ukrainians, we're Jews. But that didn't make the Ukrainians love them, and that didn't make the Poles love them either, because the Poles saw it as kind of treachery to the Polish cause, and the Ukrainians thought that Jews were really Poles in disguise. Anyway, finally, the last point I want to make about the historiography itself is that the latest historiography shows the persistence of Austrian loyalties among the Jews and among people in general in the Habsburg monarchy. I forgot his first name, Unowski. I know him well, and I can't think of his first name, but it doesn't matter. He's written about the Austrian loyalties of the Poles of Galicia. And of course, my work on Jews in World War I, Habsburg Austria, does show that the Jews remained intensely loyal to the Habsburg monarchy and to the emperor. Let me say, I'm really almost done with this talk, but I do want to say a few words about Jews and German culture in Austria. The Jews adopted German language as they modernized. After all, Joseph II, the emperor at the end of the 18th century in the 1780s, had demanded that the Jews learn German and established German Jewish schools so that they could teach their children German. And as a result, a lot of Jews in the Habsburg monarchy did learn German. Now, in Galicia and in Hungary, there was a lot of resistance to that. So there were fewer German Jewish schools established. But in Bohemia and Moravia, the Habsburgs were extremely successful, so that by the middle of the 19th century, the Jews no longer spoke Yiddish. All Jews in Europe spoke Yiddish, until then. But the Jews of Bohemia and Moravia switched from Yiddish to German. And some Jews, not most, but some Jews, both in Hungary and in Galicia, adopted German, more in Hungary than in Galicia. But Jews adopted German language as they modernized. German became the language of Jewish modernization and enabled Jews to enter European culture more broadly. German was also very easy to learn for Jews because if they came from Yiddish, after all, German and Yiddish aren't so terribly far apart. German was also a very useful language to know in Austria-Hungary. It was not the main language, but it was a very important language. But German was also a problematic language because of the nationality conflict. In the interwar period, many Jews recognized that it was a good idea to speak the state language, and so they did. But German then became the language Jews spoke to each other. It became the language of home and family and Jewish community. So what is the role of the LBI in all of this? Well, the LBI has some fabulous sources. It has a huge memoir collection that all of us who work in Austrian history have used. It has archival materials and library materials. And I think it becomes clear when you use the LBI material that Jews of Austria form part of what in German is called the Deutsche Kulturbereich, the German sort of arena of culture, but in a very complicated way. And we're all grateful to the LBI for all of its work on behalf of Jews, not just of Germany, but also of Austria. So I'm going to stop there. And now you can ask me all the questions you want to ask me.
Marsha, thank you very much for walking us through the changing historiography of the Austrian Jews. It was fascinating. So before I will start my questions, I would also like to encourage our audience to write their question in the Q&A box. However, I have a few of them, so I will start here. So you mentioned actually these changes that are so present in this historiography, and it is very clear to me that you were also part of those changes, and you were actually at the forefront of the innovative approach. And when I actually read your book, The Jews of Vienna, 1867-1914, you mentioned, and this book was published in 1984. You mentioned that your mentor István Deák was initially skeptical of quantified methods that you plan to use in the book. So could you tell us why, and also how this approach has changed over the last decades?
Well, thank you. That's right. He was skeptical because, after all, he wanted me to do what's called a prosopography, that is a collective biography. He thought it was okay to look at ordinary Jews, but I should just do a collective biography. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to look at this data, at birth records and marriage records, and I really created a database. I mean, I went through the birth records. The Jewish community was responsible for recording the births and marriages and deaths of all Jews, as was the Catholic Church for Catholics and the Protestant churches for Protestants and so forth. And so I could just go to the offices of the Jewish community and look at the birth records and marriage records and so forth. And I did a sample of every fourth birth, Jewish birth, in 1870, 1880, 1890, 1900, and 1910. And then I used a computer to analyze this data. I didn't do anything fancy. I really did not, because I'm no great mathematician and statistician. But I really liked the fact that I could see what ordinary people were doing. And István Deák was, he was skeptical of that. What would you find that we don't already know? Well, I found a lot that we didn't already know. And fortunately, he trusted me to do what I wanted to do. And then later, when he was working on his book on the officer corps of the Austro-Hungarian army, before World War I. He used quantified methods himself. He did a sample of all the officers, and he looked at them and their national origins and their languages and their religions and so forth. And he learned a lot of stuff. He learned, for example, that 17% of all reserve officers in the Austro-Hungarian army were Jewish. Wow, do you know what the percentage was in Germany? Zero. And except for doctors, but apart from doctors, there were zero reserve officers in the German army who were Jewish. 17% of the reserve officers in Austria-Hungary were Jewish. That's the reserve officers. Career officers, it was less. It was very much less. It was like 1%. I mean, Jews couldn't be career officers, but they could be reserve officers. Anyway, so now, in terms of quantified methods, it's wonderful, but it's a lot of work, and it's fallen out of favor. It was in favor when I was a graduate student. It's no longer in favor. Even I don't do it anymore. I mean, my book on World War I used more traditional sources, memoirs, newspapers, archives. My current work on the Jews who left what had the territory of what had been the Habsburg monarchy after 1938, 38, 39, 40, 41. I'm using memoirs and organizational records. I'm not doing quantified methods. Not every study lends itself to quantified methods, to be honest. I mean, there are things you can't learn from quantified methods. You can't learn what people think and feel from quantified methods. You only see social patterns. So it has its limits, even if it's wonderful in some ways.
So thank you. So continue on those actually changes. I think like a great example of changes and also is Galicia, which is of course part, and it's hard to talk about Austrian Jews and Habsburg monarchy Jews without mentioning Galicia. And with Galicia, I think we have this interesting approach, which I would compare a little bit to bipolar approach, where everybody says that, of course, Galicia was very poor, and many will say that was very backward. And then we also have this the other approach where, for example, when we see, let's say, some biographies of people who later made these big careers in Vienna and worldwide, I think a good example here is Josef Roth, who, of course, LBI also has archives. And he alone was he was born in Brody, so which is smaller town, not so far from Lviv, Lemberg back then. And of course, somebody will say that Brody was this this little town far away from Vienna, culturally, geographically, and perhaps also mentally. But at the same time, we know that Brody was also the hub for Orthodox and Haskalah, so two main movements in the Jewish tradition and religion. So how was this with this backward Galicia?
Galicia is incredibly fascinating. I agree with you. I mean, and the person who is the real expert on the Jews of Galicia is Rachel Manikin. She's an Israeli who was my colleague at the University of Maryland for many years, but she's back in Israel now. But she's still doing lots of really wonderful work, Rachel Manikin. But in any case, yeah, the Jews of Galicia are very important. First of all, they are a huge percentage of all the Jews of Austria-Hungary. There were over 2 million Jews in Austria-Hungary. It's a big Jewish community. Russia was bigger. Russia had 5 million Jews, but Germany had 500,000 Jews, right? So Austria-Hungary is way bigger. But of the over 2 million Jews in Austria-Hungary, about 1 million lived in Hungary, and just under 900,000 lived in Galicia. So there weren't very many Jews outside of those two regions. There were the Jews of Vienna, which reached 175,000 by World War I. And there were the Jews of Bohemia and Moravia, which reached, I don't know, about 145,000 altogether by World War I, right? So obviously Galicia is very important. And Galicia is very mixed. Not as mixed as Hungary, but Galicia is very mixed. You have some Jews who modernized. And spoke German or Polish or both. And you have, and we're prosperous, and we're, business people of stature, and we're doctors and lawyers and writers and so forth. You also have masses of very poor Jews, most of whom are Hasidic. Hasidism was very important in Galicia, especially in Eastern Galicia, but also in Western Galicia. So you've got everything, right? And you've got on top of that, you've got this national conflict. There are Polish speakers, the Poles, who are Catholic and who, they're sort of happy with the amount of autonomy they have in the Habsburg monarchy, but just over the border in Russia is a Polish national movement that wants Polish national independence, and some of them become attracted to that. Um, um, and they control the province, the Poles do. But they're only 40, the population of the province was about 45% Polish speaking and 45% Ukrainian speaking, Ruthenians they were called then, and 10% Yiddish speaking Jews were in the middle. And then you've got the Ukrainians, most of them are in the east, but the Poles are all over the place because the nobles own the land in Galicia, all over Galicia, and Polish nobles. Anyway, so you've got this nationality conflict between Poles and Ukrainians. You've got Jews. You've got all different kinds of Jews. Somebody like Joseph Roth, whom you mentioned, Magda, he was from Brody, but Brody actually had, as you pointed out, the Haskalah was there. I mean, Brody wasn't that small. Brody in 1900, I'm going to look it up for you. I will tell you exactly how many Jews lived in Brody in 1900 and how many people lived in Brody. Sorry that I'm taking some time to look through, but Brody, where is it? Brody, there it is. Okay, there were 17,000 people in Brody altogether, 17,361 people in Brody. So it's not a village, it's a small town, but it's not a village. There were 11,912 Jews. That means Jews were 68.6% of the population. That's 2/3 of the population of this town was Jewish, which was very common in towns all over Galicia. Not the big towns like Lemberg, what the Poles called Lvov, and the Ukrainians called Lviv, which is now in Ukraine, and Krakow in the West. Those were only 1/3 Jewish. In Galicia, a city with very few Jews was 1/3 Jewish, right? Vienna was about 8% Jewish, just to give you. So there were a lot of Jews in Brody, and buried in their background. And Joseph Roth was only one type of Jew in Brody, and so was the Rebbe of whatever, the Hasidic community. And that's what makes Galicia so interesting. That it has this diversity. And Hungary, too, had enormous diversity. You have lots of modernizing Jews, lots of modern Jews who first spoke German and then in the late 19th century switched to Hungarian because of the pressure of the Hungarian national movement. But you also have huge numbers of Hasidim in northeastern, and in southeastern Hungary, who speak Hungarian sometimes, but are totally reject modern culture, And you even have two types of Orthodox Jews in Hungary. You've got the Hasidim, and you've got the non-Hasidic ultra-Orthodox in the West. So it's a mixed bag.
And since we don't have that much time left, actually, I will move now to the questions from our audience. So the first question is, I will just read them. I think it's easier.
Yes, okay.
So Thank you so much. Truly wonderful presentation. Could you please say a few words about the complicated relationship between the Jews of Austria and the Austro-fascist regime?
Okay.
Could you recommend any recent scholarship on this?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I can see the questions, by the way, because I can look at them too, which is good. Yes, I didn't mention that because it's not my real field, but I certainly know about it. The Jews in the Austrian Republic, in that smaller Austria, were almost entirely in Vienna. There were Jews elsewhere in some other places, but mostly it was Vienna. And the Jewish community of Vienna grew to about 200,000 or so in the interwar period. The Jews didn't like the Austro-fascist regime, but they liked it a hell of a lot more than they liked the Nazis. And so they saw the Austro-fascist regime, which was in charge of Austria from 34 to 38, as the bulwark against the Nazi takeover. And remember, the Anschluss was orchestrated by Austrian Nazis in cahoots with Germany, with Nazi Germany. And the Austro-fascist regime definitely wanted to see continued Austrian independence, and it didn't want to be part of Nazi Germany, because the Austro-fascist regime was controlled by the Christian Social Party, which, while deeply anti-Semitic, was also really Catholic. And the Catholic Church in Austria did not really like the Austrians, although they made it at peace with them after the Anschluss. But they didn't like it because, remember, the Nazis were anti-Christian too. And not that they would have killed the Christians, they certainly wouldn't have, but they didn't believe in the efficacy of baptism, right? They thought that Jews who had converted, or whose parents who were the descendants of converts, were still Jewish, not Catholic, but that flew in the face of Catholic dogma. So, Austro-fascism was anti-Nazi, even if it was deeply anti-Semitic. And so the Jews supported the Austro-fascist regime because they feared worse would come if the Austro-fascists didn't succeed in keeping Austria independent, and they were right. You asked about scholarship. I suppose it's not so recent, but Harriet Friedenreich's book on the Jews of interwar, the Jewish politics in interwar Austria, would be a good place to start. Okay. You want to ask me
now the next? Yes, the next question is regarding the Chernowitz. How did Chernowitz become so Jewish? Where did Bukovinian Jews come from? And was the great influx of them post World War I mostly from Galicia?
Okay, now let me answer. The Chernowitz is really interesting. I agree. I'm glad somebody asked me about Chernowitz. Chernowitz was the capital of the Austrian province of Bukovina. It has different names in different languages, and I can't pronounce them, so I'm not going to. Chernowitz is how it's pronounced in German. It has a different name in Ukrainian and a different name in Romanian. The province of Bukovina is a province that was mostly, the Jews of Bukovina were very similar to the Jews of Galicia, and the number is smaller, but they're similar. And Bukovina was cut off from. There's a long history of Turkish occupation, and I don't want to go into the details, but it becomes part of Austria in the 18th century, as does Galicia. Czernowitz was actually a city that was it had a lot of Jews, a huge percentage of Jews, but it was a city that was largely German in its orientation. That is, a lot of people spoke German, and the Jews especially the modern Jews of Czernowitz, definitely spoke German and sided with the German speakers. Czernowitz in 1900 had about 67,000 people, of which 21,000 were Jews. So it was about a third Jewish. And the Jews there really felt that they were part of a German cultural world. And they were quite upset that the city of Czernowitz and the province of Bukovina became part of interwar Romania. And they didn't feel Romanian even remotely. But what could they do? They're in Romania. They benefited from being in Romania, actually, but during the Holocaust, because a lot of them survived because the Romanians were allies of the Nazis and fairly sloppy at persecuting them. I mean, they persecuted them, but they were sloppy about it. And a lot of those Jews left after Romania pretty much told its Jews to leave after World War II. And so they left and are no longer there. Of course, some of them were deported and killed, but they were deported by the Romanian authorities, not the German ones. So what was the second part of that question? It was about, Jews coming from Galicia to Vienna or to Czernowitz? No,
Yes,
there
if
wasn't.
they came from Galicia.
To Czernowitz? No, they always lived there. There was a Jewish population of Bukovina, and many of them were Hasidim, but in Czernowitz, maybe some came from Galicia. People had freedom of movement after 1848, so they could move. But it's not primarily a migration from Galicia.
Okay, and then we have one question also coming from Dr. Miriam Tullin, who's Associate Director of the Institute for Advanced Research here at the Center for Jewish History, which Leo Baeck Institute is also part of. And I will maybe not read, as this is a little bit longer question, but Marsha, could you please read and answer?
I'm reading. Thank you, Miriam, for
Yeah,
your very long
yeah.
and wonderful question. The oh, right. Okay. I mean, there are many questions in Miriam's very long question, and I appreciate the questions a lot. One of the questions was to compare the situation in Austria to what Till van Haden says in his book, his wonderful book on Jews and Other Breslauers. That is, he looks at the city of Breslau, which was then in Germany, but is now in Poland, and has been in Poland since 44 or 45, I don't know. But he talked about situational ethnicity. Sometimes they were totally German, sometimes they were more Jewish, depending on the situation. Excuse me, is there something like that for Habsburg Austria? No, not as good a book, not as detailed a study as Till van Raden's study is. But my work, I have 3 articles on the Jews of Moravia, and one of the things I explore is to what extent were they German, to what extent were they Jewish, were they sometimes German and sometimes Jewish? So those articles address the issue. And I argue, I actually don't say they're sometimes German and sometimes Jewish. I actually say they're always German Jews. That is, both parts of their identity are important to them. They do feel themselves German, but they're only part of the German world as long as they could do so as Jews. And you can see that, I argue, in interwar Czechoslovakia. In 1935, in interwar Czechoslovakia, most of the German speakers of the country voted for the Sudeten German Party, which was an anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi Germany party. 2/3, I mean, not all, but a huge percentage. Jews, of course, were horrified by that. And immediately when that happened, these German-speaking Jews in Moravia said, we're Czechs now. We are Czechs. And they started to keep their minutes in Czech in their Jewish communities, which had been in German until 1935. They started, their schools went completely, to the extent that they had separate Jewish schools. The schools became completely Czech, and Jewish, but Czech in language, not German in language. They just, that doesn't mean they didn't speak German to themselves, amongst themselves. They just means that they stopped using German publicly. And that's a sign that their Jewishness was more important to them than their Germanness. Now, of course, it's an extremist. Obviously, the Sudeten German Party was a very anti-Semitic political party and was, played a role in the process of Germanizing Bohemia and Moravia, the Sudetenland, after 1938, after 38 and 39. So that's an important thing. So I sort of think it's situational ethnicity. No, I don't want to do that. But it's not quite situational ethnicity, but his book was very influential in my thinking, because situational ethnicity is a nice way to try to understand the Jews. What trends in current Jewish history? Oh, that's a harder question to answer. I have to think about that. Are there some other questions, Magda? Maybe I'll circle back to Miriam's second question.
So as we actually already passed 1 o'clock, I would actually, I will allow myself to ask the last question, and which can be also a summary and the final conclusions to our talk. So, Marcia, which topics in the field of the Austrian Jewish history are still to be discovered? And you think which methodologies and historical methods and approaches we can still use for them?
Oh, it's related to Miriam's question, so I can answer them together. Do you know, it's really a good question. And I don't know how to answer that simply because, people choose topics which interest them personally, right? I'm still interested in the question of national affiliation, um, although that seems to be waning as an interest of historians who are younger and so forth. I'm interested in issues of Jewish identity, and that seems to be waning as an issue. Um, I'm not quite sure what is an issue. Maybe I'm no Miriam can't join the conversation. I wish she could because she knows about this stuff. Um, what is there to be done? I mean, there's a lot that needs to be done, but that isn't being done, about Jews. Um, because it's hard to work on these Jews because you have to know a lot of languages, right? You have to know a lot of languages. To do the Jews of Galicia, for example, you have to know Hebrew and Yiddish and German and Polish and Ukrainian. And how many people know all of those languages, right? And English. You have to know English too for the secondary literature. Um, and I add the English because, of course, there are scholars who, from other countries. To Now, nobody who does the work on the Jews of Galicia knows all those languages. They just don't. So some know Polish, some know Ukrainian, um, and it's so that's hard. And Hungary too. I mean, how do you do Hungarian? I mean, there's huge amounts of work that can be done on the Jews in Hungary, but you have to know a lot of languages. You have to know Hungarian and German. Doesn't hurt to know Ukrainian. Of course, you have to know Hebrew and Yiddish, and it's just never ended. There's so many languages. When many years ago, 40 odd years ago, a very important scholar of Hungary, I'm an American, named William McCagg, did a study of the Jews of the Habsburg monarchy, but he didn't know either Hebrew and Yiddish. He knew a lot of languages. He knew German and Polish and Hungarian and so forth. He knew a lot of languages, more than most people, but he didn't know Hebrew and Yiddish. And he was totally destroyed in the book reviews. How could you work on the Jews of this region without knowing Hebrew and Yiddish? And so it is complicated, and a lot of Israeli scholars who work on the Jews of Hungary or on Galicia, they only know Hebrew and Yiddish and English, and they don't know Polish, and Ukrainian. How could you do it without Polish and Ukrainian, right? So it's hard work to do this, and I have never been able to really work on the Jews of all the Jews of the Habsburg monarchy, because what do I know? I know English, of course, German, Hebrew, and Yiddish. But I don't know Polish. I don't know Czech. I don't know Hungarian, and I'm too old to learn them. I mean, obviously, younger scholars can learn them, but you see the problem. It's very hard to do this work, and um, so I don't know how to answer your question. I don't know exactly how to answer it, but I think it is exciting. There is room for lots of work to be done because most work has not yet been done. Of course, a lot of archives were destroyed in World War II, so it's not so easy to do all the work that you might want to do. But not everything was destroyed. So
Let's hope that if there is any young scholar among the audience, he or she will take it as an encouragement to start the linguistic journey. And
absolutely.
I would like to thank you, Marcia, once again for the fascinating talk. And to our audience, I hope you can join us for the last talk with Deborah Hertz on gender on December 3rd. Thank you very much. Bye.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.